trans ideology largely defends, excuses trans women who are men. Trans women are women. There's no debate. So that's how it's harmful. Because, of course, if you believe that, then of course you will have men going for cervical smear tests. Of course you will have women going to have their prostate examined. This is 50, 60 years after the beginning of gay liberation, for God's sake. They're now practicing conversion therapy on same-sex attracted kids. We are frightened of him. You know, I saw him, for example, with a stiffy, queuing up for breakfast. We're scared.
Can't have that.
And they were told, well, you know...
Her stiffy.
Her penis. And,
yeah.
you know... And I still maintain that today there isn't one person alive that believes that trans women are women. The trans bit is a clue, and the fact that they're men is another one.
How does trans ideology allow men to carry out evil acts?
Well, the problem that we have is that male violence towards women and girls, and of course other men, but I'm concerned with the type that's towards women and girls, is pretty regular. It's not uncommon. It's a minority of men, but it's a majority of men that carry the attitude that says it's not so bad, maybe she asked for it, we don't believe her. So trans ideology largely defends, excuses trans women who are men. They're not a subset of women. They are men who claim to be women, feel they are women, or identify as women, or all of those three things. And so they offend against women and girls at the same rate and in the same way as other men. It's very straightforward. But what trans ideology does is it fools some of the public, it fools some of the legislators, the criminal justice agencies, and some women themselves, that these are not dangerous. You can't talk about trans women as men. In fact, in the wise words of Ruth Hunt and so many more since her, trans women are women. There's no debate. So that's how it's harmful.
It's pretty mad, that, isn't it? Did you ever see this coming? At what point did you go, oh, they really mean it when they say that?
When they say trans women are women, that's a good question, because I first got into public trouble as opposed to just being disagreed with in polite society at journalist events and the like in 2004, when I wrote a piece for The Guardian where I railed against a case taken against a brilliant feminist advocacy and campaigning organisation in Canada, Vancouver Relief. And they had said no to a trans-identified male, a trans woman called Kimberly Nixon, who wanted to be on the volunteer programme to be trained to counsel and give support to victims. And they politely, the relief women, said no, because he would be read as a man. And women who've been raped, this may surprise or not some of your viewers, but they tend not to want to see a man when they've been raped by a man, because only men can commit rape. And so waiting in the wings were the human rights organisation, a bit like our Liberty here in the UK, who offered to take a case on his behalf. And 20 years of litigation ensued against Rape Relief, where they almost closed down, and the stress was horrific for the volunteers and for the staff. So it was obvious that what was happening then, when they came after me in 2004 for writing a very reasonable article saying men shouldn't be counselling rape victims and posing as women, that this was a nasty, vicious group of misogynists, of men's rights activists that were trying to shut down feminist discourse, feminist organisations, and the right for women to be women only. But at that time, I didn't think anyone on the planet would pretend to believe that trans women are women. And I still maintain that today there isn't one person alive that believes that trans women are women. The trans bit is a clue, and the fact that they're men is another one. I think that many people genuinely believe that trans-identified males should be allowed to identify as women, should be given all of the legal rights and access to women-only services and facilities. But I don't think that they think for a second that they are women. We all know the material reality of our biological sex and the significance of that. And so I saw it coming at around, I think, 2011, 12, when trans activists were really organising big style because, of course, social media by then was widely used. The Guardian newspaper had sold out fully to this ideology. Trans rights activists were training the media. They were going into newspaper offices and telling editors and staff that they should always refer to trans people with the correct pronouns. In other words, the opposite to the sex that they are. And it really was starting to get very, very concerning about the capture of institutions, because of course once the media goes, then others will follow. And it was then that I started hearing trans identified males, trans women, say things like, "We are female." They started using that language. So I reckon it was probably about a decade ago.
I feel like some of them do genuinely believe that these men are women. I did a poll on my YouTube channel. It was a previous channel, another channel I have, and I said, "What percentage? What do you think are trans women?" Literally, and I put that in capital letters, not in the way that people are these days saying literally. I mean, literally, are women, and 10% said that they are, which is remarkable. And then you get into these debates with them online and they start saying, well, you can't prove anything because a woman, what's a womb? Some women don't have wombs. Some women can't give, and all of these kinds of things. Of course, I mean, gametes, I think, is where you can finally sort of say, okay, well, hang on, what about the gametes and things? But they really make that kind of argument. I think some of them are that lost.
I don't think that any of them believe that trans women are women. I think that 10% have been convinced that that's what they should say. I think that many of them do absolutely think and believe and hold firm that trans women should be treated as women, should be given all of the legal rights as women. But everybody knows what a woman and a man, a male and a female is. And obviously as a feminist and, the kind of proper type, I am not a biological essentialist. I probably in my time, definitely in my time, in younger years, have played down the significance of biological differences between women and men in order to counter the sexist nonsense about women can't do this, can't do that.
Yeah.
Women are naturally feminine, men are naturally masculine.
Yeah.
And so I have definitely played that down. And I'm a bit more realistic about it now. And I mean, you have to be when it comes to looking at the huge difference between male and female athletes, for example. However fit and at the top of their game they are. Martina Navratilova said, and she's the, our greatest champion of all time on the tennis courts. She said, any 100-seeded male player would beat me.
I'd probably beat her.
Yeah, I mean,
I took up tennis last year.
You were bouncing that ball when I came in. But anyway, I have downplayed it. Other feminists of my stripe have. And that doesn't mean that by admitting the significance of those biological differences, that my feminism is any way different or compromised. It's just that I'm being a bit more honest about.
Does that suggest you weren't being honest before?
I think it was more that I didn't. Yeah, probably, actually. I think that's fair. I think I didn't want to face up to the fact that my argument might not sound quite as convincing about how women can do anything, and this is all to do with sexism. Because, of course, the arguments back in the 1980s, when I was probably at my most rabid as a feminist, and through my early 20s and onwards, there was a lot of sexism around. It was de rigueur. It was just the kind of default position. And so you found yourself arguing against the most ridiculous things, like women shouldn't go to work when they've had babies, and women can't do physical work such as plumbing and carpentry. And there was this big drive, which was great, and it's still around, to get women on apprenticeships to be trained as builders, in the building trade, construction workers. And they were called Women in Manual Trades, and they were fantastic. And so that was countering that sexist assumption that women couldn't do anything of that nature. And I think within those arguments, I went too far.
I guess we have that difficulty of we are biological animals that have biological differences, but we also philosophically we've chosen as a community or as a society to have individual liberty. So any man or woman or anything should be able to aspire to anything they want. But they might be less primed women, for example, to go into building work. That might be a biological thing, or it might be a social thing.
Well, I think once you start telling women we can do anything we like and everything is open to us, and this is all about individual rights. I mean, that's not feminism. That really grates alongside feminist principles and ideals, which is that if you just look at individual liberty, you assume everything's a level playing field and women will be left behind. So it's a fine line. But I do think, and I've really, really spent time thinking hard about this, because the Orwellian madness that surrounds me and has surrounded me with this debate for 2 decades has made me do so. Does anyone really believe trans women are women, trans men are men? No, they don't. And this is how it's got us into the trouble we're in. Because, of course, if you believe that, and if you genuinely put that forward as the thesis and as the basis on which we build society, then of course you will have men going for cervical smear tests. Of course you will have women going to have their prostate examined. You will not be able to organise society in the way that it needs to be organised in a practical way, let alone the rights that women have fought for and won that are now under such great threat that in many countries they're being actually rolled back.
It did seem like we finally got to a point of, or getting towards a point with the Me Too stuff, and it was okay, people were taking women seriously more than they were previously, right, I think. And at that point, it seems like men went, yeah, but now we can be women as well, and sort of interfere with those rights.
Well, I'd love to think that women were being taken seriously during the Me Too. I mean, it wasn't a move.
But more so than before.
I don't know. I think that over and over again, we've had these moments in time, haven't we? Me Too was not a movement, it was a moment. Before that, we had, what got me into feminism, and in particular to the campaigns to expose and to challenge men's violence, rape, domestic violence, prostitution and the like, was the case in West Yorkshire of Peter Sutcliffe, known as the Yorkshire Ripper. And so at that time in the 1970s, when I was growing up, the misogyny was it was astounding that you would just get on a bus when Peter Sutcliffe was still killing women and the police had failed to catch him, and saying things like, "You're right, love, give us a kiss." And when you told them to do one, you'd be told, "Well, I might be the Ripper. I'm going to follow you off the bus."
Did that happen to you?
It happened to me, and it happened to every single woman that I knew. And, Leeds United football supporters, because Sutcliffe was murdering women largely in the north of England and the northwest, would be chanting 12-0, 12-0 to the police before he killed his final victim, because he killed 13 at least before he was captured by accident by some police outside of West Yorkshire, because the police were penning them in Ellen Road football ground. And, there were all of these kind of examples of rank misogyny that got me into feminism. And that was a huge moment, because what was exposed at that time was that the media that were referring to innocent victims, in other words, women that weren't in street prostitution, that Sutcliffe had murdered, the police that was talking about, well, he might kill, there might be more pawns. We were the pawns. before we catch him, like it was some sort of cockfight between a serial killer and police officers. And where women were being told, there's a curfew on our freedom. If you're worried about the Ripper, as they referred to him, you should stay at home. And we thought that the curfew should be, of course, on men. And so that was a big moment where misogyny was exposed and it was challenged, and Reclaim the Night marches began. And we started to campaign against pornography, easily accessible pornography, which wasn't as easily accessible as it is now. You actually had to go to a cinema in those days to watch pornography and then rent a video. Right.
Weird.
So, but it was easily accessible in that it wasn't, you didn't have to get a boat over to Amsterdam to watch it.
Right.
But we campaigned against the normalisation of women being seen as slags and whores or precious bone china that you needed to protect. And then from that, all the way through my four and a half decades of feminism, there's been moment after moment after moment building up to the Sarah Everard rape and murder, where yet again we have, well, now people are listening. Well, women are being taken seriously. And at the same time, just this week, figures have been published that show that domestic violence incidents, reported domestic violence incidents, which will be a tiny minority of those that happen, are massively on the rise. And yet convictions have plummeted. So I'm sick of moments. There has to be some kind of revolution. And I don't mean a revolution like chopping off aristocrats' heads. I mean something truly revolutionary where it's recognised that women live under a state of tyranny, where it's just seen as every day when we open the newspaper and see yet another woman has been killed by her violent husband because she was about to leave him.
Yeah, that is horrible. You'd like to think it was, I mean, it's a hard one, isn't it? Because they are just going to be nutters no matter what. 1% of men are psychopaths. I mean, what can you do about them? They go out with women and then they kill the women. Well, how can a society change to stop those psychopaths?
Well, as you say, 1% doesn't really account for the number of homicides.
It's a lot of people, 1%,
but
of 30 million men.
I haven't scrutinised those figures or the consequences of that, because obviously if you talk about violent men with serious mental disorders, then that's an issue. It's a factor. But that's not a reason why men will kill women, because obviously psychopaths or people with a very, very serious mental disorder might not hone in on females as their victims and throw in a bit of sexual violence and rape at the same time. So how do we explain that?
Well, yeah. Well, it's a difficult one, and then the trans situation's made things even harder. Would you say?
Well, the trans situation is, I think, responsible for the worst misogynistic backlash towards feminism and women in general demanding their rights and spaces, many of whom won't be feminists, than in my lifetime, for sure. For the simple reason that this particular men's rights movement, misogynistic men's rights movement, has been, I suppose, embraced by or ignored by the normies, regular citizens, liberals, those that would normally see what was happening to us and be on our side. For example, back in the late 1980s, men's rights activists started demanding that the family courts give them access to their children, because any time a woman made a allegation of domestic violence or sexual abuse of the children, that she was lying, that this was all about false memory implanted in children, that children were coached by their mothers to say that the father or the stepfather had raped them, that the family courts judges should always just ignore these women and they should be given custody and they should be given visitation rights and access and the like. Now, that's not to say that every single allegation of child abuse or domestic violence will be a genuine one, but the vast majority are. And yet that group of men who you've probably seen ended up, I don't know, jumping off high buildings or wearing superhero outfits to draw attention to themselves and get media coverage. You know, they were clearly really going for women and saying that feminism had ruined men's lives and feminism had gone too far and women had more rights than men. And the normies and the liberals, who don't really engage with either side of this argument, knew that was outrageous. It's obvious the majority of victims of domestic violence, serious domestic violence, are women. It's very clear that child sexual abuse in the home is endemic. We've known that for a long time, and that the more likely perpetrators will be an older male relative. So we had those people on our side. And similarly with government departments, when these men went to them and said, the majority of domestic violence, and they did say this, is perpetrated by women to men, and we need our own refugees, and we need you to start arresting these women. It was clearly a backlash, and I can give you countless other examples of when that had happened, when the Liberals saw the outrageousness of these claims and did not collude with them. That's all we need. Just don't collude with them. With the trans issue, with gender ideology, many of the kind of, I suppose, the middle-class metropolitan elite decided that what trans activists were demanding was the same as what lesbians and gay men were demanding back in the 70s. And they thought, oh, I didn't really do much for that fight then, or they weren't around. And I really should support them because it's just like lesbians and gay men. You know, our daughter's a lesbian. She's just come out age 17. You know, this is right and proper. But it never was about rights that the lesbian and gay organisations fought for. It was about removing the rights of people that happen to be in need of those rights, in other words, women. So they've got it really wrong. And I blame them way more than I do the relatively small number of extreme trans activists. And of course, most of those extreme trans activists aren't trans themselves. It's the likes of Owen Jones and other idiots.
Owen Jones and Other Idiots, a book by Julie Bindel. That's what you should have out next. Yes. Well, okay. So to steel man a little bit, I mean, not all trans people or trans activists intend to take away rights of women, do they?
Absolutely not. The vast majority of people that wish to live as the opposite sex just want to get on with their lives. The trans-identified men, trans women that I've met over the years, and there have been many, and there's at least 2 that I would count as my friends, just want to get on with life and not take the rights of women away and not demand that they're referred to as female. And many of these men that transition are, in my view, the victims of patriarchy, to use a very old-fashioned word here, Andrew, and victims of the medical profession that's driven by patriarchy.
Yes. Right. What are you saying here?
So these men, many of these men are the victims of patriarchy. They've been young gay men, usually with some kind of hellish background, hellish childhood, want to escape their bodies. And some psychiatrist signs them off as transgender. And the next thing they're on hormones and having surgery. And I've met many of these men, and some of them really regret transitioning. Some of them just live their lives in a kind of, you know, fairly satisfied way. But most, I would say, have regretted it. Trans activists, do all trans activists want to remove the rights of women? Well, yes, actually, because in order to get their rights, which is the right to define as women and be accepted in law as women, yes, they have to remove our rights. Because we can't all be in a space, in a women-only space, can we?
No.
Because then it just becomes a mixed sex space. And there's some really smug lawyer who irritates me just to the point of no return, who keeps saying on...
Oh, I know who you mean.
Yeah.
I think, on Twitter.
Yeah, he keeps saying, it's not pie. It's not pie, you know. It's not that you lose a slice of pie if you give it to the trans people. Well, we know that. Because actually, if we were to say to trans people, as I have over the years, we will help you by giving you pointers as to how you can set up your own refuges, your own rape crisis centres, your own hostels and facilities for trans women only, We will do that because we built ours from scratch with no funding. What we don't want is you in our spaces. And then some trans activists, including this smug lawyer, will say, so you're saying all trans women are rapists then? You're saying all trans women are dangerous, predatory, risk to women? And I say to them what I said 40 odd years ago when I first became a feminist, and I was challenged on this by straightforward, ordinary blokes who were just sexist and not pretending to be women. When they said to me, why do you need your own refuges, love? Are you saying we're all rapists? And I said, no, ordinary man with a beard. I'm not saying that. I'm saying enough of you are that we need to make sure we keep all of you out. And that way we stay safe. Right?
Yeah.
Because we've never said all men are rapists. We've never said all men are potential rapists. We've said we don't know which men are going to pose a risk to us if they come into our swimming baths and changing rooms and refuges. We really don't know because you tend not to have it written on your forehead. And actually, you tend not to look like a nonce or a batterer or a rapist. There's no such thing. It's just men that make that choice to do that have been given carte blanche to do that. And I say the same to these so-called allies, like the smug lawyer. We've never said all trans women, all trans-identified men are going to sexually assault women. They'll just do it at the same rate, the same pattern, the same percentage as other men.
Yeah. We make laws for the extremes, don't we? I mean, we have a law not to murder. I don't go around going, why is that law there? I'm never going to murder.
Right.
And
Exactly.
if I do murder, I'll go to prison.
Well, you might. Depends who you murder.
Yes, that's a good point as well. Let's see how it goes. So in prisons, do we actually have a situation in the UK where trans women, so men who identify as women, are sharing cells and things with women?
Not cells, but wings. So facilities, showers, recreational areas. Oh, yes. Yeah, I interviewed, I think it was probably 3 or 4 years ago. It was certainly before lockdown, and I've lost track now. A woman who was in prison with a really dangerous sexual predator, a man who was accepted as a trans woman, who was sexually assaulted by him. And she told me, and it was a heartbreaking interview because she was both tough and vulnerable, as women in the prison system, tend to be. And she said to me, look, I went to the prison officers and I said, we feel scared about this trans woman. They had to use the language. They had to say she, and they had to call, him Dolly or whatever he was choosing to be called.
Yeah.
We are frightened of him. I saw him, for example, with a stiffy, queuing up for breakfast. We're scared.
Can't have that.
And they were told, well,
her stiffy. As Ricky Gervais would say.
Her penis. And, as a woman in Australia once said to me, when I explained that The Guardian had run a story with the phrase her penis, she said, the only time that we should ever allow that phrase is if a woman has tracked down her rapist, chopped off his donger and held it up as some sort of trophy.
Yeah.
But anyway, to go back to this woman in prison, she was told by the prison officers that she would be on a charge of transphobia if she continued to make that complaint, because this trans woman was just living her best life, bringing her whole self to prison, right? And the prison officers, the female prison officers, were clearly scared about being called transphobic, clearly. So anyway, sexual assaults ensued, of course.
Yeah.
And eventually, my interviewee, brilliant woman, took a case against the prison service.
Wow.
And got so far with it, didn't win the whole case. But this is something that is happening. This is something that female prisoners aren't able to talk about because they're the most disenfranchised population imaginable. So who are they going to tell? Well, they might tell, if they're lucky enough to have a prisoner's rights lawyer advocating for them, someone like me talking to them, a sympathetic probation officer, for example, then they can speak about it. But where is the information going to get to? Because, of course, trans women are women. And the Ministry of Justice and the prison service haven't yet agreed to do what we have been asking them to do, which is to say no man should ever be in women's prisons. And incidentally, as a feminist law reform campaigner of, many decades, I have been part of a group of feminists that have been campaigning for no men to be in women's prisons ever, including, of course, male prison officers. And what trans rights activists say, and they've said it to me directly, well, isn't it interesting that Julie Bindel is concerned about trans women in women's prisons, but not about male prison officers? Well, it's there to see that I've been saying this forever. And Ash Sarkar, another trans rights activist,
Yes.
Another plonker, cut from the same cloth as Owen Jones, I think, did a Twitter search once of my name after I had railed against men in women's prisons, trans women in women's prisons, and yet another sexual assault that had been alleged. And she looked on Twitter, she searched my name alongside a female prisoner who had taken her own life. Terrible, terrible case that I had actually, as it happens, written about. And said, isn't it interesting? Julie Bindel has never tweeted about this case. I'd actually written in a newspaper about it. So that was the extent of her journalistic research, doing a Twitter search with my name.
Yeah, that's the modern way.
I mean, unbelievably crass. And actually, many of us have been saying it's not safe for women to be in prison with any men.
So this is the issue, and this is the issue that when I speak about the trans thing as well, a lot of people say, oh, you're transphobic, you're saying transphobic things, and it's really just about, well, men are not supposed to be. I grew up knowing that I'm not supposed to be in certain places. It would be weird if I was in the women's changing rooms. I don't particularly want to be there anyway, but it would be weird if I was, not because I'm a threat, but because men have long been a threat. And I think you can talk about that without being one of those men's feminists things, because they can be a bit weird as well.
Yeah, of course.
And so I agree with you. And then people sometimes want, they go, why are you obsessed with the trans thing? Because I have sort of gone on into it quite a bit. And I just think we're literally in a situation, for anyone wondering still why this is important, we're in a situation, as you just explained, where they literally put men in women's prisons because people say, there's a certain ideology, so now we have to have that, and they're women.
Right. And if you say they're women, then that's the logical conclusion, isn't it? But the other side of this, of course, is young lesbians. Now, when I was a young lesbian, when I hadn't come out, and this was in the 70s, and it was really not good to come out as a lesbian in the 70s. And I was in the northeast of England on quite a rough housing estate, with lots of poverty and crime and the like. And the school was reflective of that. And it really was not good to come out as a lesbian. And having these feelings, having a crush on my best friend, knowing that I wasn't attracted to boys, where you're called either a lesbian, a leser, or a slag. They're the two options. And lesbian is clearly better, obviously.
Yeah, for you.
Yeah. But it was a horrible, horrible time. And I mean, these things still happen now. I wanted to be a boy. I desperately wanted to be like my two brothers. They had more freedom. They could wear better clothes. I hated wearing tights. I hated having to go to school in that uniform. I hated the fact that I was attracted to girls and not boys. I felt like a freak. I felt like a weirdo when my next door neighbour that I used to babysit their kids for a couple of hours after school when I was 15, when they heard rumours that I was a lesbian, because me and my school friend were fooling around a little bit, they stopped me from babysitting because they thought I might sexually abuse their kids, because that's how they thought of lesbians. I was told when I did come out, and it wasn't exactly my choice, but I relished it once I'd done it. It felt liberating. And I was still at school. I was told, you must be a boy. Which one of you's the man? And this is what you're told, because you, of course, are doing something very, very different to the norm. Girls and women aren't supposed to reject men sexually in favour of other girls and women. This is an abhorrence. It breaks all the rules. And had I had middle-class parents 40 years down the road, I would have gone to that gender clinic. I'm telling you. And I was never... I mean, there's no such thing as a transsexual, as transgender. There's no such thing as being trapped in the wrong body. It's a mad diagnosis created by deeply sexist psychiatrists back in the day when they couldn't work out gender nonconformity, where gender rules were so rigid. But I would have been down that clinic quick as a shot.
That had taken skin from your thigh and sort of pushed it in, like, or from your shin, I think, and pushed it in through your thigh and sort of pulled it out of your vagina.
Right. Well, phalloplasties are a whole other discussion because they are an absolute mutilation of the female body. But I look at young lesbians now and I talk to them and I interview them, and I've spoken to just recently young women at a conference I was at the weekend who socially or even hormonally transitioned, began that process, were allowed to begin that process, were coerced, I think, into beginning that process by this ideology, who of course now deeply regret it. I also know lesbians who were sent down that route because they were same-sex attracted, had body dysphoria. There's no such thing as gender dysphoria. It's body dysphoria, which many girls growing up, and a number of boys too, and who hated their bodies, often because of sexual abuse, often because of other forms of trauma. And, well, here you've got a same-sex attracted girl. Well, that's a bit off, isn't it? I mean, this is 50, 60 years after the beginning of gay liberation, for God's sake. They're now practicing conversion therapy on same-sex attracted kids. And so I also care about those trans-identified young women that are saying that they're trans men.
Yeah.
Because there's really very little coming back from them. I mean, they have irreversible surgery, and testosterone is an extremely powerful drug. And, you know, once you've got facial hair, once you've got a beard, once you've got muscle mass, once you've got, you know, receding hairline, once you've had a double mastectomy that they euphemistically call top surgery, you know, this is a very difficult place to reverse back.
The early onset gender dysphoria, or whatever it might be called, for young women. I used to live in Argentina. I know I keep talking about this. I'm sorry for people listening because I've become obsessed with this idea. Out there, they practice exorcism, like not in the modern part of Buenos Aires, but out in the impoverished suburbs, they do exorcism, and it's loads of 16-year-old girls who are trying to assert control over their bodies. They think there's something wrong with their bodies,
Right.
something inside them, like a gendered soul or whatever it might be, and they have these mad, crazy exorcisms, and it gives them a placebo effect, and they feel better, and they're like, I'm definitely cured, I'm great. A year later, they're back to where they were.
Of course.
Or they might have gotten past that adolescent part anyway, because it's such a difficult age, adolescence, when, you know, so maybe within a year they've become 18 or 19 and they're just a bit over it anyway. And like the parallels between exorcism and early onset gender dysphoria are just remarkable.
That's interesting. I know what conversion therapy is, and I know what this religious madness is. In 2013, I was researching a book on lesbian and gay culture of the day. It was during the kind of Stonewall was getting more and more powerful, and the trans lobby were definitely on the rise, as we spoke about earlier. And I was looking at the rights of lesbians in particular in a context where we're supposed to have won those rights. 2013 was the year where equal marriage became law. We'd had civil partnerships and adoption and fostering rights. I mean, it looked like our legal rights were on parallel with heterosexual people. But my thought was, and it was borne out in my research for the book, that there had never been as wide a gap between legislation and culture. In other words, the legislation was all tickety-boo, but what was going on societally was pretty grim. And I'd, of course, known about gay conversion therapy, and a couple of male journalists had gone undercover to examine this process and report on it and, of course, condemn it because,
Sure.
you know, you'd be an absolute loon job if you didn't. And I thought, well, I need to look at what's happening with lesbians, and I want to go to a kind of Bible Belt community. And so I found an outfit, so-called therapists, in Colorado, which was a deeply religious community. It was where the notorious school shooting had
Right.
happened, which had driven a lot of people even further into quite a kind of fundamentalist Christian religion. And I had a persona, I had a new identity, and I had Skype calls with the therapist before I travelled to Colorado. And my story was that I had lost my family and I'd lost my church because I'd been found kissing my school friend in the kitchen, that I'd been thrown out, that I'd had deeply unhappy relationships ever since, that I'd never really got to grips with being a lesbian, that I felt self-hatred, self-doubt. Now, all of that can be explained, of course, which is why I constructed the story, as anti-lesbian bigotry coming from the outside. You're thrown out of your family. You've lost all of your roots. The church has said that you can't be involved any longer because Jesus doesn't love you. All of it can be explained. My unhappiness could all be explained by anti-lesbian prejudice. All of my failed relationships with women because of my own self-doubt, because of the turmoil that caused by external forces. But of course, the therapist took this as me being a broken person who something terrible had happened to in my childhood that had sent me down this terrible path that I needed to be brought back from. So I went to Colorado. I spent a week in this heavy-duty, intense so-called therapy. And I heard from her that there were young women who she believed were actually trapped in the wrong bodies because they were very butch, they were very boyish, they wanted to dress in boys' clothes, and she wondered if they could be. And in fact, she was chatting away to me, asking me what I thought about, had I ever met this phenomena? And I avoided the topic. And the so-called therapy was so deeply distressing, even to me, an out and proud lesbian of, at that time, more than 4 decades, I can't remember, I've lost track of time, who was very, very proud of being a lesbian. And I still found it extremely distressing to go through what she was trying to do. And what I worked out through that process was that these conversion therapists don't think they can make you straight. They don't think for 1 minute that I was going to go back and start getting it on with Nigel at the house church playing his guitar. But she just wanted to stop me being a lesbian. And this is what conversion therapy is. So how trans activists can say that sitting down and allowing a young person who feels trapped in the wrong body and gender dysphoric, or however they explain it, that is the same as actually doing what they did to me, which is saying my mother didn't love me, I was broken, was I sexually abused by the men in my household, was I dropped on my head as a baby? How they can say that they're the same thing is beyond belief. And these idiotic politicians like Angela Eagle and whoever else that are saying that, trying to give these kids that are being pushed down the trans route an opportunity to explore whatever trauma has brought them to believe they're trapped in the wrong body, is an outrage.
They wanted to make you a boy then, is that right? This conversion clinic?
Well, no, she just wanted me to stop being a lesbian. I mean, you know, this is the thing. They know that you know, your sexuality, and I've never believed in the gay gene, but that's not the point. They know your sexuality is very hardwired at quite an early age, and that I wasn't going to, like I say, get it on with Nigel down the house church. But
Who was this Nigel?
Well, you see, I had to...
This handsome man at the church.
Yeah, I mean, he strummed his guitar and sang
bet he
Come
did.
By Our.
Yeah, bet he did. So you've said some really, I mean, controversial things about sexuality. As you say, you don't believe in a gay gene, that you've said there's a choice. Do you stand by that? And why is that controversial to say?
I think I put it very crudely at the time, and I wish I'd taken more time to explain in more detail what I meant, but newspaper articles tend not to kind of allow you to do that. But even so, it's my responsibility. I don't mean a choice like, well, I think I might go to Hastings tomorrow, or should I go to Margate? By disputing any evidence about the gay gene, it's quite straightforward. They would have found it by now. What would it mean anyway? Would it mean that there'd have to be a bisexual gene? Would there have to be a child abuser gene? Would there have to be a late onset lesbian gene? So someone who only developed the gene when she was 40, 50, 60, even 70, because many women come out in later life, having been in heterosexual, relationships, marriages and the like. What would that mean when lesbians and gay men, because they do exist, decide, do you know what? I've just met someone of the opposite sex and fallen in love or lust, and that's it now. That happens more regularly than we think.
Does it?
It does, yeah.
I always feel like it's the other way around. They fall in love, Philip Schofield or whatever it might be.
That's more common.
They have the family because they're not letting themselves be them. I've always imagined they're sort of hard deep down, and maybe they sort of love this woman, but it's not quite how other people.
Yeah, absolutely. That's more common, and particularly for women who have less freedom to come out as lesbians earlier on and tend to be a bit railroaded into marriage and just go along with that because it's hard to come out. But yeah, I mean, what does it mean if there's a gay gene? How would that play out for those that actually do meet someone by just some great opportunity, forget the prejudices and the difficulties and the potential consequences, the anti-lesbian bigotry, anything like that, and just think, do you know what? Really, I've been in the closet for too long, or I've been, my subconscious has been kind of hiding this for too long. I've just met this woman. I've fallen madly in love, or I fancy her like crazy. That's it. The time is now. Now, it doesn't really matter if there's a gay gene or not, except for those that insist that there is, will have it that you're born that way. So you're literally born fancying the midwife. You're born with a sexuality and a sexual response, which of course we're not. They insist that those that have been in relationships with the opposite sex aren't genuine lesbians. They insist that, of course, a woman who comes out later in life is a bisexual, despite the fact that she has no sexual interest in men from that moment on and had pretty much none prior to that. And so I think the word choice needs to be explained here in the way that I used it. There are many women who are in the closet, consciously or subconsciously, because it's very hard to come out as a lesbian in many, many circumstances, communities, jobs, etc. And so therefore, if you then further down the line, like some of the miners' wives, when Greenham Common in the 1980s was a very vibrant women-only community, and the miners' wives were thinking, we're sick of these strikes, we'll go and help our sisters trying to stop the nuclear bomb blowing up the world, that they ended up getting it on in tents with lesbians at Greenham Common. And oh my God, there I was married to a miner, and now look, I'm wildly in love or lust with this woman that I've just met, and that's it. I prefer this. This is much better. It suits me way better, and I'm going to leave him and become a lesbian. That happens a lot.
But I think people would argue they were always a lesbian. They just weren't able to show it.
They can argue all they like, but the thing is that it's either dormant or it's subconscious or it's unconscious. But how does that explain them being in reasonably happy and even quite happy and even sexually satisfied relationships with men when bisexuality doesn't really fit that bill, because they then have no interest in men whatsoever further down the line. Now, at that point, that woman, and I know many, many, many lesbians who've come out later in life, who will say, my God, it's great being a lesbian. And gay men, and those very invested in that we're born that way, we can't help it, just be tolerant of us, give us our rights, we're normal just like you, we just happen to have this kink in our genes. Many gay men, like when Cynthia Nixon came out and said, I know what it's like to be gay, and I know what it's like to be straight, and I know which one I prefer. They go wild and say, what do you mean you prefer it? You either are or you aren't. Well, she actually said, okay, I've got this crossroads in my life right now, and I could kind of just get on with being heterosexual in this way that isn't really ringing my bell, or I could actually say, do you know what, being a lesbian is great. So that's the element of choice I'm talking about.
I spoke to Dr. James Cantor one time, and he suggested that the sexuality experienced by gay men and gay women is very different, and that gay men, from his research, which I don't know if it's been reproduced much, it was often the younger child. It didn't matter that there was it didn't have to be an older brother, but just that, I mean, even if there was an aborted fetus, as long as there had been fetuses that had left some sort of trace in the womb, for whatever reason, it made it more likely with each fetus that had been there that the next child would be gay. So that would imply you're born with that. Whereas women, he seemed to suggest that there was like an adverse childhood effects around men, or men, they didn't like men, or whatever it was. And it was more like what you're saying, a sort of, I'm going to go this other way.
No, I've read all of these studies, all of them. I've interviewed lots of these scientists, many of them gay men, who say it's the twin syndrome and
Yes.
reasons. I mean, for lesbians, if your mother actually took some kind of Valium when she was pregnant with you, all of these, none of it bears out because, of course, they're very small samples and, well, everyone would have to, the sample would have to be pretty uniform. Lesbianism is not as a response to traumatic experiences with men. It's not because it's the second best thing, it's the safest thing, because when we're growing up, we are raped, sexually assaulted, bullied, harassed, sexually, abused in some way. But many girls and women, of course, have that experience growing up. Someone wanted sexual attention. It's way more common than we like to admit. So does that mean then, it's like cause and correlation, does that mean that lesbians, well, if you interview them, the vast majority will have had an unwanted sexual experience as girls? Well, so many women that I speak to, I'm always pleased when I meet one that hasn't been flashed at, hasn't been sexually harassed, hasn't been touched inappropriately, hasn't been raped. It's great to meet women that really haven't. So none of this pans out. Lesbianism is a positive, it's a great sexual,
not a lack of
experience. Exactly. It's a very positive experience. I don't know who to thank that I'm a lesbian, but I'd
love it.
grateful.
I'd love to be a lesbian. I would.
Well, many men say that, you see.
Do they?
On dating apps and the like.
Yeah.
Some of them have got bushier beards than you.
Yeah, well, they're trying to actually pretend they are lesbian, whereas I'm just saying, like, there's a small part of me that would enjoy a few days of being a lesbian, just to know what it is to be a different person.
What would you do?
What would I do? I'm in a relationship, but if I was single, I would go on the dating apps, meet some women, enjoy some women chat. I'd probably have to experience having a period, even though it's supposed to be horrible, because you've got to have that, right? If I'm having a few, not just a few days. If I've got a few weeks, maybe. Okay.
Yeah, for sure.
So I'd do that. And my very male brain, maybe, I don't know, is thinking I would get involved in sexual things as a lesbian with a woman.
But would you be a man doing this, or would you have become a woman in this fantasy world?
In the fantasy world, I am literally a woman who is a lesbian. Just because I'm going to be dead in 30 years. We discussed this before this started. I've probably got something bad because I can't stop coughing, right?
But we did talk about this, the hypochondriac to hypochondriac. Yes. And it's very probably something that you don't need to worry about. But this lesbian thing, there's a whole porn genre, of course, called girl on girl action. Vicky and her huge sex toy meets Pamela, in the gym. And this is the thing about lesbianism that is always misunderstood. It's not something that women do for men. And yet constantly we're trying to disentangle ourselves from men in whichever way you think about. And I don't mean in terms of friendship or professionally, but I mean the kind of, well, I'm a lesbian because of what these men did to me when I was a girl. Well, I'm a lesbian and I really like it because there's this whole porn genre that men tell me is really great. So there must be something acceptable about it.
Well, I don't really believe that's what being a lesbian's about. It's just that in my male mind.
But I think it's a really interesting point because there is even women who aren't consciously trying to disentangle themselves from men sexually. If you Google lesbian, the first thing that'll come up is girl on girl action porn. It won't be the Lesbian Project that I'm a co-director of with Kathleen Stock. It won't be something to do with lesbian health studies or lesbian bars. It'll be girl on girl action.
Men get turned on by it and they search it in Google.
Yeah, that's right.
Whereas lesbians, probably there's fewer who are just lesbians, and also how often are they actually just typing in the word lesbian? Not as much as men who are looking them up.
That's right. We need to get the algorithm sorted out on Google.
Plus, they're probably not really, most of those girl and girl action things are not really lesbians, are they?
No, I went to a bar once in London to do some interviews with strippers. They had hired for this women-only bar a group of women who were supposedly lap dancers, great entertainers. There was a load of lesbians standing around whooping and trying to put £5 notes in their bras. It was a horrific scene. There was very little to choose between it and strip clubs populated by men with female strippers. And I interviewed the women, and of course, none of them were lesbians.
No.
They had come from the usual countries where trafficking into the sex trade occurred.
Oh, gosh.
And they were just, being paid and didn't appreciate the women behaving like a load of men in a strip club at all. They probably thought it was marginally less bad, but not by much.
What happened recently at the first Do No Harm conference?
Well, I was there on Saturday, just 3 or 4 days ago.
And what is it as well?
And it's a conference organised by medics, by clinicians who are dealing with transgender medicine, therapy and the like. So there are psychotherapists there are doctors, psychologists and everyone that has a stake in this. And what they were doing was looking at whether or not, and I think we all know the answer to this, that children in particular are being harmed by being sent on a trans pathway. Therapeutically, in other words, the affirmation, a 15-year-old, 16-year-old girl presents at the gender clinic and says, I'm a boy. And the next thing, they're calling her in for her appointment by saying, Mr. Smith. And through to hormone blockers and then cross-sex hormones, surgery, and a life of medicine and surgical intervention. And the speakers were just asking questions as to whether or not, and again, we know the answer, this has been an experiment, a medical experiment on children, and the biggest medical scandal of our time, which it absolutely has, bigger than thalidomide. At least with thalidomide, although it was horrific outcomes and consequences, somebody was trying to actually solve a problem of sickness during pregnancy, first trimester pregnancy, and ended up with what are known as thalidomide babies. With this experimentation on young people, it's built on an absolute fantasy. It's creating the fantasy, the fiction of a transgender child, rather than looking at why this child is presenting with a myriad of problems, self-harm, eating disorders, the feeling of being trapped in the wrong body, etc. Why aren't they being tackled separately from this ideology imposed upon them, which is that you're trans? And so many of these young people, as we heard at the conference, suffer from some type of autism, experience some type of autism. Now, what was happening outside of the conference, which I saw when I arrived a little bit early, so the baying mob hadn't yet gathered, but there were some protesters with loudhailers and the like. They tried to storm the building. The Antifa men with the black masks, there were lots of women, the trans maidens, the handmaidens, as they may be known, were also there screaming about trans rights, screaming about doctors. So they were saying doctors have no right to look at this huge spike in diagnoses of the trans child, except for just to give them the medication and the treatment that they are demanding. A kind of treatment totally driven, not partly driven, totally driven by ideology. So these protesters outside were banging on the doors, trying to storm the building. Who knows what would have happened if they'd got in the building?
They were really pushing the door open, weren't they?
Oh, completely. I mean, there's footage that I put out at the time on X that shows that they were really meaning it. They wanted to get into that building, and they're these macho men in masks.
Attacking women.
There was a whole female security team, and they were bloody good. And, it was dealt with, and the police finally showed up and did their job.
Yeesh.
But they were a violent, baying mob trying to shut down, very eminent professionals that were brave enough to speak out against the grain and suffer the consequences about the biggest medical scandal in our modern day period. And yet they were proven right. Puberty blockers are no longer going to be administered, although cross-sex hormone drugs are for 16-year-olds, which is the next battle.
Yeah.
It's beyond belief. I'm shocked at how bad this has got.
I've got one more question for you, but first tell me where people can go and follow you and all of your stuff.
You can subscribe to the Lesbian Project podcast, which is on Substack. You can also subscribe to my Substack. Easy to find. And on X, I am Bindel J, Bindelj. And just Google. I'm the only Bindel in the UK, so it's dead easy.
Oh, well, there you go. And who is a heretic that the only Bindel in the UK admires?
Can I have two?
Yes.
My first is a man. My friend Bob Jensen, who's an American academic, journalist, writer, campaigner, activist campaigning against sexism in all its forms, particularly violence against women and girls, and the porn industry. And Bob is a heretic because, well, he's a man. Why is he doing this? He doesn't need to do this. He can just enjoy sipping his beer, reading his porn mag, and, having a kind of chat with his mates about how women drive him mad. He could just be doing everyday sexism or not doing anything at all, because actually most men aren't sexist pigs. So Bob could just be an ordinary guy doing nothing, being a bystander.
Sure. But
Bob has devoted his life to social justice causes, and I know that phrase has become very sullied, but he's a proper one. And I've interviewed Bob about the work that he does for Spectator TV in a series called Action Men, where I've interviewed other men who are doing this work. Not the ones that wear the T-shirt. This is what a feminist looks like. No, mate, That's what a dickhead looks like.
Yeah.
So that's Bob. That's my first
guys.
Heretic. Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Okay, who's the second one?
J.K. Rowling.
Oh.
Because she's a children's author who is our probably most famous author of all time. And kids and young adults and pretty much everybody else adore her. And actually, under the Harry Potter novels, under the kind of, I suppose, comforting cloak of the Harry Potter novels, grew up a generation of those that ended up getting septum rings and blue fringes and, being queer and a bit kind of, out there. Some of whom have turned into terrible, dreadful bullies and bigots, screaming for women to be raped and murdered, including Jo Rowling and many of us. And what does she do? She sees how women are being monstered, called fascists and the like, and she can't not speak out. So she speaks out, and they come after her too, and she stands firm. And she refuses to go back into the box that they created for her. And for that, I love her.
She's the best. I love J.K. Rowling. People, please go and follow Julie Bindel. And there's a description thing. I'll put it below as well with some of the links and things. Keep on watching this channel. I'll have something similar right here. And also go and support the podcast on andrewgold.locals.com. I've got a couple more questions for Julie on Locals. So come and see us there and keep watching this.